Welcome back to another episode of the Miami Heat Roundtable. I'm your host, Amir. You can find me on the Team to Beat Miami Heat podcast, and I'm joined today by Martel. You can find him on the Miami Heat Zone podcast. And for today's episode, we have a special guest joining the show. We have Alex Solana from WQAM. Thanks for joining us today, Alex.
Absolutely, guys. Looking forward to it.
So, Alex, before we get started, though, do you want to introduce yourself real quick to the audience?
Yeah, sure. So I know Tobin was on with you guys a couple days ago. I love Tobin. He's the best. So I work at the same radio station as him. He does middays 10 to 2 from with Tobin and Leroy. And then I'm on the afternoon drive show with Hockman and Crowder, former NFL player Channing Crowder, played with the Dolphins. So I'm the executive producer of that show, kind of like the third voice of that show as well. And then I am the pre-halftime and post-game host for the Miami Heat radio broadcast as well. So I know, a lot of people our age aren't exactly tuning into radio all the time. I realize that. But if you're driving to the game and you're in your car and you don't feel like listening to a podcast and you want to get ready for Heat broadcasts, then, I'm on the air with Jason Jackson, who does the broadcast, Amy Audibert, they do the broadcast, play-by-play, Tommy Tighe, who's a radio legend. The four of us are your Miami Heat radio network. So that's where you can catch me.
I love it. I'm a lifelong Heat fan from California, and the Heat are the only South Florida team I like. You can see the hat that I'm wearing here. I live in San Francisco. I'm a Bay Area fan, everything else, but still diehard Miami Heat fan. Obviously, I have a Miami Heat podcast, but to your point, because I live in the Bay, I listen to the local radio when I'm driving around, so I listen to the Niners. So I don't have the luxury of listening to you. If I lived in Miami, I would listen to you every single day. So
awesome.
Thank you so much for joining. Thanks for the introduction. So Alex, the Miami Heat have had a relatively quiet offseason so far, and many fans, specifically on Twitter, seem to be very upset. And we have 2 roster spots still open. So we have 13 standard contracts, and it does still seem like we're going to run it back. You never know. There might be an option to trade for a third star. And right now we are kind of still focusing on that blended build and timeline of having Jimmy Butler and also having young guys now enter our system. So my question for you is, how do you feel about the current state of the Miami Heat, this roster, and what are your thoughts on next season?
So I realize the frustration with the idea of running it back. Like I'm fully aware. Most people feel like the ceiling of this team, if they were to run it back, even best case scenario, everybody's healthy, which, let's be honest, I don't think that's something you can expect at this point. That everybody, Tyler Hero is going to go 82 games. Jimmy Butler he's not going to play 82, but let's say contract year, best case scenario, Jimmy gives you 75 games, 72 games, right? And he's playing not only because he wants to lift the Heat back to a respectable spot in the Eastern Conference, a much improved Eastern Conference, but also he's approaching this as a contract year, right? Where he wants to not only prove to the Heat, but prove to perhaps outside suitors if things don't go right with Miami, hey, I'm still worthy of a max extension. I'm still worthy of big time money. Even if all those things fall into line and Bam takes more strides, I feel like most people consider this best case scenario a 6 seed in the Eastern Conference. And I think that's about fair. I still believe this team is better suited in the playoffs than in the regular season. I stand by that. I believe if Jimmy Butler would have been healthy and not gotten hurt against the Sixers in that play-in game, the Heat probably end up winning that game. And we could all be talking very differently about the Heat's offseason. Who knows what happens? I'm not saying they go back to the NBA Finals. I'm not saying they beat Boston. There's clearly a talent gap in between the top of the East and the Miami Heat. But I also get this sense that we tend to live in the moment as fans, and the way the season ended was bad. There's no doubt about it. Injuries, everybody was hurt. At no point throughout the season could you get continuity with the roster, with the rotation. You were constantly saying, well, when Tyler gets back, okay, now you trade for Rozier. Well, when Rozier, Hero, Bam, and Jimmy are all on the floor, how's this going to look? They need 2-3 weeks together. And then it just never materialized. So I realize we're all living in the moment. We all remember how sour it ended, and nobody wants to relive that. Like, I realize that. But I also believe when you look at the Heat not being able to trade for DeMar DeRozan and the reaction to that, I truthfully don't understand. Would I have liked DeMar DeRozan? Sure. I think you could argue would have made the team better. But what it would have taken to A, get DeMar DeRozan, and B, if it doesn't work out with DeMar DeRozan, what it would have taken to get him, now perhaps you're sitting next year in a worse spot than you were this year. So I know people don't want the Heat to run it back. I'm probably in that camp as well, but I also don't want the Heat to avoid running it back, do something dramatic and perhaps worsen their future by doing so. The reality is, in this 5-year window with Jimmy Butler, the Heat went to 2 NBA finals. They had 3 long postseason runs. And I think that's something, while A, you didn't win a championship. Yes, that's unfortunate because of the aspirations of this organization. B, it's not something that you just scoff at and you say, oh, who cares? What have you done for me now? Like, appreciate what this group has done while also criticizing the front office. That's fine. But I'm not in, to kind of sum up my thoughts here, I know I was a bit long-winded. I'm not in this, it's over, this front office is washed, Pat Riley, sleepy, like, I'm not there. I'm just not. I'm not happy with where things are currently, but I'm also not at the point where I'm just giving up on this team, giving up on this roster. If they run it back, and who knows, things could change, right? There could be a Trae Young or some other disgruntled star that asks out, and it works out for Miami to trade for him. But if they do run it back, which is looking more and more likely that that's the case as of right now, I'm not simply just going to punt on this team. Like, I still think they can be a formidable force in the East. Can they win the East? I don't know. I wouldn't bet on it. But yeah, I'm definitely not at the point where I'm just like taking shots at the front office, and I'm just not there yet.
I love that you said that though, because people forget that it's really hard to win an NBA championship. And you can criticize the Miami Heat's front office, which is fair. Like, since 2016, after not giving Dwayne Wade that contract, letting him go to the Chicago Bulls, like, we've made some mistakes, gave out some bad contracts to make up for that with James Johnson, Tyler Johnson, all those guys. And then, of course, attaching first round picks in these sign and trades, which most teams don't do. We saw DeMar, you mentioned earlier, we missed out on DeMar. They didn't have to. The Bulls didn't have to attach a first round pick or the Kings, excuse me, didn't have to attach a first round pick. So there are some mistakes there, but we are a top tier organization still. There are bumps in the road, and again, we haven't been the best front office in the last few years, but only a third of all NBA teams have won a championship. Right. So, like, there's 33% of NBA teams have not won a single championship. There are only 8 teams that have won 2 or more. Literally 8 teams that have won 2 or more, right? So it's really hard to win a championship. So we can't take for granted what Jimmy Butler has done, what Pat Riley, what Mickey has done. You could say Mickey's cheap. We had the 7th most expensive team in the
Yeah.
NBA last year. And
Yeah.
also to your point with DeMar DeRozan missing out, we're a first apron luxury team. As part of the penalty, we can't even do a sign and trade until
Right.
we're below that. And that means we would have to get rid of a Duncan, Terry, Tyler, Jimmy, or whoever to get under that first apron. Like, because we don't have anybody else really making $8 million, because all of the rest of the guys are on rookie scale contracts, like Jaime, like Jovic, like Kalel, and then the rest of the guys are on minimum contracts. So you have to get rid of one of our top 5 guys to even do a sign and trade, right?
And so when I was when the whole DeMar DeRozan thing came up, so on my afternoon drive show with Hockman and Crowder, Hawk and Crowder, going back to the 2022 season when the Heat were going to play the Bulls in that play-in tournament game. Remember, we had lost to the Hawks and then we were playing the Bulls, just like it happened this year, but this was 2 years ago. We got into this whole thing because Hawk and Crowder were arguing that DeMar DeRozan was better than Jimmy Butler. And it turned it right. I think it was more like they were just trying to get under my skin and trigger me a little bit, and it worked. But it turned into this thing where now they're the DeMar DeRozan army on our show, whatever. So as you can imagine, this is carried over now, considering the fact that the Heat keep playing the Bulls in the effing playing tournament game. When the news came through that the Heat at one point were favorites to get DeMar DeRozan, they were kind of pumping their chest like, uh-oh, you're going to have to change your tune a bit on DeMar. And my whole thing with DeMar, as you just mentioned, the penalties of being a first apron team. Imagine if the Heat would have traded Tyler Hero, let's just say I'm just throwing out names here. This is totally just me kind of whiffing on the trade, but Tyler Hero and maybe a pick attached to that just to offload that salary, maybe, right? Because everybody would know around the league, well, the Heat need to offload this salary in order to go through with that sign-in trade. Let's try to at least get everything we can from them, plus the extra 7-8 million that they would have had to have gotten rid of to just figure out a way to get DeMar DeRozan to sign whatever it was he was going to take, which at that point we knew was more than that mid-level exception because he wasn't interested, according to Crispy Haynes, of taking any mid-level exceptions from any other team. So you're looking at like a $15 to $25 million range, multiple years, right? It's not just 1 year, it's multiple years. Going into a Jimmy contract year, my whole thing was, I'm cool with DeMar, Jimmy, and Bam for a year. But am I cool with DeMar and Bam after that and no Jimmy Butler if it doesn't work out, right? If the Heat and Jimmy decide amicably to part ways after this year, hey, we tried it again. This has kind of run its course. No bad blood. Jimmy, go get your money. Go to a championship contender. We're going to build around Bam. We're going to try to focus on the future. But now you're signed to DeMar DeRozan at what, 36, 37 years old to whatever it was. Now we know what he got with the Kings. Like that to me just didn't make sense. So going all in, getting rid of a young asset in a Tyler Hero or a Terry Rozier, even if they're not the most attractive assets outside of Miami, I realize that, to me, it didn't make sense long term if DeMar, Jimmy, and Bam didn't work. And I didn't feel like the trio of DeMar, Jimmy, and Bam was a surefire go all in on it. I just didn't feel like that's the answer the Heat are looking for. Would it have been nice? Yes. But I feel, and correct me if I'm wrong, at this point, the social media fan base just wants assets and they just want movement for the sake of movement rather than making the right moves. They just want movement. And I am highly against that. Like I want the Heat front office to maximize Jimmy Butler and they haven't done so. I want the Heat front office to go get another superstar. They haven't done so. But what I don't want is movement and trades for the sake of making trades. And I think that is where, this social media culture has kind of developed into that, where like free agency hits and everybody's just like crack addicts waiting for that Woj and Shams bomb. And I'm guilty of it too. And I want my team to be a part of it. It's fun, but not if it's going to jeopardize our future.
All right, so you mentioned the future a lot. So do you think that this Miami Heat, team is really focusing on the future? Because when you think about it, obviously, Bam Adebayo, he is our future cornerstone piece. And we do have Jaime Jaquez Jr., we do have Jovic. Now we just drafted Khalil Ware and Larson. And just from how the team already looks right now in terms of lack of assets, they really can't trade with other teams because, some teams don't want Tyler Hero's salary. And, this organization is trying to get away from like attaching picks to kind of rectify some of their mistakes. So, do you think that this Miami Heat team right now is focusing on going young with that Bam Adebayo timeline? Plus, they're not really looking into paying Jimmy Butler right now. So, what is your overall take on the team going young?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that it's fair that the Heat are focusing on the future, right? Like they're not prioritizing the future. I know Heat fans are gonna be upset, but I still think, as Barry Jackson is always saying, like he's being told from people within the organization, like they still like their team, So I don't think it's fair, and I know people hate that, but
We have enough. We
I
have enough.
believe it, right? I believe it. I believe that the Heat front office is kind of looking at this like, hey, I mean, we have Tyler, we have Terry Rozier, we have Jaime Jaquez Jr., we have Niko Jovic, and then we still have Jimmy and Bam. Like this isn't doomsday, But I wouldn't say it's fair that they're prioritizing the future, but I do think they want to remain flexible because throughout those James Johnson years and Dion Waiters years, and even after, the Heat at times were not able to go make the acquisitions or the moves that they wanted to because of lack of flexibility, lack of first round picks. And we traded our souls for the big three era. So I don't think anybody was upset about it, but they don't want to be in that same position, right? As they're kind of looking ahead to the next era of Heat basketball, probably centered around Bam Adebayo. So they're remaining flexible, which is why there's still 2 roster spots available. And hey, I don't blame them considering A, you do have Bam Adebayo, and B, with the way this team has drafted and developed undrafted players and drafted players as well, I think that's the right way to approach it, right? Like you can still believe that You can maximize this group that you have. You can still believe that even if you don't, there's an avenue to trade for a better player. Or worst case scenario, which I don't think is a bad scenario. Okay, this era runs its course. Now you continue to develop the players that you've done so. Khalil Ware looked pretty good to me in Summer League yesterday. I know we have to temper our expectations, but now you move ahead, staying beneath that second apron where it could jeopardize, and as you said, Amir, the penalties can be severe. You start kind of this soft rebuild because you know the Heat are never going to tank, but you start this soft rebuild and your flexibility keeps you in the game. So I wouldn't say that they're prioritizing the future. I just think like they're cognizant of it, like they're very aware. Hey, if this doesn't work out, there is a plan B moving ahead.
So when you look at Jimmy Butler, listen, like I think he's been absolutely phenomenal. Like in terms of he's been able to do more with less. Because you also did mention that they really didn't maximize Jimmy Butler's window, like in terms of the players around him. So going into next season, do you think it's worth just giving him that one extra year? He is getting older. We don't really know if he'll be able to play 65 games. Plus, that's going to come at a high number on the payroll. So, what is your feelings on Jimmy Butler? Do you still think he has enough left in the tank at least one more miracle run?
Yeah, so when the whole Jimmy extension talk was happening, I was kind of in the camp of I don't want to give Jimmy Butler that max extension, but I understood why the Heat would have done so. Just to kind of A, keep him happy, B, reward the guy for a tremendous era. I don't think that's a bad thing to do. And C, if you were going to give Jimmy that extension, right? That 3-year extension, which essentially would have eliminated the player option. He would have played out this year and it would have been like a 2-year max extension. The idea there is, hey, it's not to just have Jimmy set up for the future and that be your core. The idea is, okay, we envision Jimmy and Bam still being your pillars, and what else can we go get, right? Like, what else can we go build around them? But with the way it's kind of played out, which is Jimmy Butler has said, hey, I'm going to play out this year, and then next year we'll see. My guess is he's going to decline that player option. Whether things go well with Miami this year or things don't, he's going to decline that player option. If the Heat somehow miraculously get back to the NBA Finals or go on another deep playoff run, I'm telling you, next year people are going to feel different about Jimmy Butler. Right now, things are soured. He didn't have the best year. He declined a little bit. He's gotten a year older. He got hurt in that play-in tournament game. He only played 60 games. Like, the reaction to Jimmy Butler right now is, hey, this guy is not going to lead your team. And maybe they're right. But I still feel like he's capable of it. We've seen it before. He can still be a key member, a core member of a championship winning team. Can he be the best player in a championship winning team? Maybe not, right? Like, maybe not. But I think, the way it kind of played out for both parties was best case scenario.
Yeah. I don't think he could be that 1A anymore, but I think he could have been, especially if he had a Tyler Hero. Like the number 3 was not the best, right? He
Right.
didn't have that Chris Middleton
Yeah,
type of player, right?
for sure.
Giannis eventually got Drew, and then Middleton, he got his championship, and Jimmy did more with less, as Martel likes to say.
Yeah.
And I'm okay with the whole giving him that extra year because, like, we haven't seen him fall off a cliff yet. We saw like his
Right.
ability to put pressure at the rim, like getting to like finishing at the rim, that percentage has gone down. His free throws are going to go down, especially now that they're allowing a little more physicality. We saw like after the All-Star break, they were calling less fouls in the paint, which I actually appreciate. I'm a 90s kid, so I don't need it to go back to the 90s era, but like it seems more like they're allowing a little more physicality, which is nice, but that's not good for Jimmy Butler's game. But he hasn't fallen off a cliff like Lowry did at the same age. Lowry at age 35 had that one good season with Miami and, went from averaging 18 or 19 like he did at best to like 9 or 10 points per game. And then it went down to 5 or 6. Jimmy was still averaging 21, 5 and 5. Like, he's still a good player. And we saw that he does coast to a certain degree in the regular season because before he got hurt and hurt his knee in that playing game against the Sixers, you saw playoff Jimmy activated. You saw him with 3 or 4 steals like in the first half, like alone, right? Like, you saw him engaged as a two-way player. And that's the frustration. It's like, hey, we're like not the best regular season team. To your point, we're more built for the playoffs, which is like a oxymoron to kind of say, because you have to be a good regular season team historically to win a championship. And I'm like the stats guy, so I like to say this all the time. If you're not a top 3 seed team in the NBA in the last 78 years since they've had 8 seeds or whatever, or that's like the last 40 years they've had 8 seeds, but in general, you don't win a championship. 52
Yeah.
of the last 78 champions were the 1 seed. Like, that's 67% of those championships. Like, you have to be a good regular season team. 97% of the last 78 years were 1 through 3, right? So you have to
Right.
still be a good regular season team. Are we capable? We'll see. But anyway, my last question for you is, would you like to see the Heat make a move this offseason for a player like Brandon Ingram? I don't know if we have the assets like Martel said, but like if we can somehow convince them that Jaime and Jovic or even Kalel, those are draft picks, right? Essentially, those are first round picks. We only have
Right.
one tradable pick. Would you be willing to take that one last stab, I guess, with Jimmy Butler? Because again, we're in a blended build right now. Would you go for that Markkanen? Would you go for that Brandon Ingram or Trae Young? Or do you think they should just fill out their roster with a wing player, maybe another backup point guard, and just let the chips fall next season and then hope to have some space in the future when some of our contracts expire and maybe shoot for like a Luka, De'Aaron Fox, or whoever's available in 2026, 2027?
The next big superstar to go well hunting for. Yeah, so I'm not against a Lauri Markkanen because or even, Brandon Ingram. I just think when you're looking at what it's going to take for those types of trades, I think it's going to price the Heat out. I really do. I mean, you look at what the Knicks had to give up for Mikal Bridges, and the Knicks go all in for that. I mean, if it doesn't work, right? Like now New York is sitting in a spot where they just went all in on Jalen Brunson, Julius Randle, Bridges. What happens if that doesn't work for them? Well, then they're the Brooklyn Nets in 5-6 years, right? The Brooklyn Nets have nowhere to go right now. Like they're just in this awful situation. And there's several examples of that. The Utah Jazz give up two of their best players, and like that's where Heat fans want to be in like this perpetual rebuild mode with assets. Like they want to be Oklahoma City. I realize it looks great now to be Oklahoma City, but is that so? I don't want to I don't want to give up a ton and kind of handicap the future to go after a Lauri Markkanen or a Brandon Ingram. If you can get them for the right price, sure, because I think those guys you can kind of build around, especially with Bam Adebayo. But I still, when I'm looking at the rest of the Eastern Conference, I don't see either of those guys as players that are going to elevate this roster to be in that championship content, like as championship contenders, like to put them in that echelon of championship teams. And that's not an indictment on those guys. Like I think the world of Lauri, like I think he's great. And I think Brandon Ingram's really good when he's healthy. But you're going after Brandon Ingram and potentially giving up, young guys who can be core members of this team, maybe not star members, but core members of this team who are cheap to go after another guy who's injured all the time in Brandon Ingram. And how's that fit going to look like? We're constantly talking about spacing and lack of shooting. Last year, our offense wasn't great. Yeah, Ingram's great offensively with the ball in his hands, but is that fit necessarily the best next to Jimmy Butler? Can he be relied upon to shoot a high percentage from three off the ball? Like, I don't know. I think there's a lot of questions there. I know Lauri can, but again, I just think the Utah Jazz, if you're looking at that to be the solution for you, good luck, because we haven't exactly had the best luck with trading with the guys running the shots over there in Utah. So I guess my answer is I think this Heat team is it's going to run its course here. I think they're going to run it back. And I kind of expected it coming into the offseason. So I'm not as disappointed as other people, but I know that's like worst case scenario for a lot of Heat fans. I realize that. You were talking about stats earlier, Amir. And I mean, when Jimmy Butler, Bam Adebayo, and Tyler Hero are on the floor together, those three healthy, they haven't been great. You know, like they're not a great team record wise.
Yeah, below 500 in like 80 games played together. So yeah, it's
Right.
a good point.
And then, even going back to Jimmy, the conversation we were just having, I also understand part of the frustration is he's missing games, but he's at the Miami Open. A lot of people aren't thrilled with that. So all that comes into play here. Like nobody wants to see this team have a repeat of last year because you just feel like it's a wasted year. But as Martel, I told you earlier, like I don't want this Heat team to get desperate, and I don't think they will. I don't think Pat Riley and Andy Ellisberg give three bleeps about what a random person on Twitter saying. But I don't want them to get desperate and just give up the few assets that they currently have available to them, so that this team can get a bit better, right? Like stay flexible because at some point there's going to be a better option, in my opinion.
Yeah, so sometimes I always say, you sometimes have to lose to win later. And I think that's not necessarily tank, but maybe you might have to take a step back to remain flexible because once you
Yeah.
start making all these marginal moves and start locking yourself into contracts, now you're kind of stuck, So hopefully, we as Heat fans were kind of spoiled, and we kind of have to just remain patient and just kind of maybe take one or two L's for a season or two and just be able to come back strong because I do think we have a solid young core. Even if we keep Tyler and everybody, I still think we have a young core. But once again, Alex, thank you so much for coming on the show. Where can the people find you on the radio, and where can they find you on Twitter?
Yeah, thanks, guys. I appreciate you bringing me on. I'm on Twitter at Alex M Solana, Twitter, Instagram, and again 2 to 6 weekdays on Hockman and Crowder. Once Heat season picks back up, an hour before and after the game, I'm your pre and post game host, and during the halftime as well. You can hear me and Tommy Ty giving reports with Jason Jackson, Amy Audibert. That's on 560 WQAM. And Amir, if you download a little plug here, you download the free Odyssey app, and you can listen anywhere in the United States. You can listen to our pre, halftime, post game, and the entire broadcast as well.
And I will because I'm on California, so games don't end late for me, right? So
Yeah,
that's a benefit of being a
that's
California Heat
huge.
fan. So I will
That's huge
definitely
for
tune
you.
in. Yeah, thanks for that tip.
Yeah.
Guys, so make sure that you guys go over to his Twitter. Make sure that you guys follow him on Twitter. Make sure that you guys go to that same link that he's talking about and go follow us during the regular season. And thank you for all the support.
Dude, thank you so much.